Subscribe because it's free.
They called it the trial of the unworthy, a ceremony of absolute submission. The Kraveth, towering and armored in their chitinous exoskeletons, stood in a semicircle around the stone pedestal, their violet eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. The hall was filled with representatives from a dozen species, all of whom had either submitted to the Kraveth Empire or suffered extinction trying to resist. And at the center of it all stood humanity's chosen representative, Dr. Elias Carter. The gobble before him hissed as it ate through the last remnants of its container. The poison was so corrosive that even the reinforced crystalline vessel was barely holding it. Carter glanced at it, unimpressed. His gaze swept across the gathered crowd, some staring at him with pity, others with amusement. They all knew how this would end. The Kraveth had done this ritual for centuries. Their empire thrived on dominance, not just the battlefield, but the very essence of life itself. The toxin they had engineered was absolute, a death sentence written in molecular bonds. A single drop was enough to turn an alien's insides into a bubbling mass of liquefied organs. No species had ever survived it. None had even lasted a full minute before succumbing to agonizing death. Carter knew the stories. He had studied the physiology of the victims, read the reports of those who had dared resist, and seen the recordings of their last, desperate moments. Every species had tried something. Force fields, biotic enhancements, metabolic stasis. All failed. The poison was absolute. The verdict was final. That was the power the Kraveth wielded. That was their unchallenged authority. The High Warlord, a massive creature with dark crimson plating and jagged mandibles, took a step forward. "Human," he intoned, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "You stand before the galaxy. Your species has been found untested. Today, you will know your place." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some felt this was unnecessary. Humanity had only recently entered the galactic stage. They weren't an empire. They weren't a threat. They were explorers, scientists, traders. The idea that they could defy the Kraveth was laughable. Carter lifted the goblet. It fizzled against his fingers, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even hesitate. The warlord narrowed his eyes, waiting for the telltale signs of fear. The trembling hands, the desperate bargaining, the futile prayers. But none came. Carter simply swirled the liquid, as if appraising a fine wine. A chuckle echoed from the back of the room. A Zalari noble leaned toward a companion, whispering, "Pity. I had hoped humans would last longer than the Zephyri." At least they screamed. Carter heard it, but ignored it. Instead, he took a deep breath, raised the goblet in a mock toast, and without another word, he drank. Gasps filled the room. A few flinched, as if expecting him to burst into flames or convulse into a heap. The High Warlord leaned forward slightly, mandibles twitching in anticipation. 1 second. 2. 3. Nothing. Carter exhaled through his nose, tilted his head as if he had just swallowed something mildly unpleasant. He smacked his lips, set the empty goblet down, and let out a quiet hum. The silence was deafening. A warlord in the back turned to a scientist, whispering harshly in their guttural tongue. The scientist scrambled for a scanner, already rechecking the chemical composition of the toxin. Carter flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders. "Little bitter," he said casually. "Burns going down, like bad tequila." He paused, then raised an eyebrow. "Got anything stronger?" A dozen alien species, all from different corners of the galaxy, all with their own cultures, languages, and evolutionary paths, stood frozen in place. No one spoke. No one moved. The impossible had just happened before their eyes. The High Warlord's claws twitched at his side. Impossible? Carter smirked. Apparently not. The chamber remained deathly silent. Carter could feel the weight of 100 alien eyes drilling into him, searching for any sign of deception, a trick, a delayed reaction, anything that could explain how he was still standing. The High Warlord took a slow step forward, his mandibles clicking in frustration. No species has ever survived the trial. Not one in the history of the Kraveth Dominion. You should be dead. Carter shrugged. Yeah, well, biology's weird like that. A scientist among the Kraveth, smaller and wiry, hurried forward with a scanning device. The red glow of the analysis beam washed over Carter's face, painting him in eerie light. He stood still, letting them confirm the truth for themselves. Unaltered toxin. No filtration systems detected. No metabolic dampeners. The scientist's voice wavered, uncertain. Human remains functional. A surge of hushed conversation swept through the chamber. The other species present, most of whom had long accepted the Kravetha's dominance as an undeniable reality, suddenly saw cracks in the Empire's invincibility. The Zalari noble who had mocked him earlier leaned forward, his elongated fingers tapping against his crystalline armrest. "Fascinating," he murmured. "What else can they survive?" The High Warlord's patience was wearing thin. His species had ruled through absolute certainty, through the knowledge that their supremacy was not to be questioned. And yet here stood a human, still breathing, still smirking. The Warlord's claws flexed. "You lie. This is a deception. No flesh can endure the venom of the Kraveth." Carter gave a lazy sigh. "Look, I get it. You're mad. This was supposed to be your big show of dominance, right? Parade me out, melt my insides, remind the galaxy that you're still the top dogs? And now, here I am, ruining the moment." The Warlord's mandibles flared. "This cannot be." Carter held up a finger. "Tell you what, let's make this fair." He leaned on the pedestal, tapping it thoughtfully. "How about another round? Just to be sure." The gathered aliens exchanged glances. Some still believed a delayed reaction would strike him down at any moment. Others were beginning to suspect something far worse, that the poison simply didn't work on humans. The scientist hesitated, then retrieved another goblet, this time pouring a fresh dose directly from a container. The new liquid hissed as it touched the surface, just as volatile, just as deadly. Carter took it without hesitation. The High Warlord was watching him with unblinking intensity. The chamber held its breath. He downed it in one gulp. The silence stretched longer this time. Carter clicked his tongue, shook his head. "Yeah, definitely reminds me of cheap tequila. Burns a little, but nothing crazy." He set the goblet down with a clink. "Seriously, though, this is the best you've got?" The Warlord's talons scraped against the floor. His mind was racing. A challenge had been issued, one that should never have been possible. And yet the human stood before him, whole, unharmed, unimpressed. For the first time in centuries, the Kraveth had encountered something they couldn't break. The Kraveth scientists' mandibles twitched as they stared at their scanner in disbelief. The readings were clear. Carter's vitals were stable. No cellular breakdown. No sign of distress. The poison that had erased entire civilizations had done nothing. The High Warlord's voice was sharp. "Explain this." Carter exhaled, rubbing his chin as if debating how much to say. Then, with a shrug, he began. "See, the thing is, you designed this poison based on what works on most species in the galaxy. But humans were built differently." Murmurs rippled through the audience. The Kraveth weren't the kind to make mistakes. Their toxin was absolute. There shouldn't have been exceptions. Carter tapped his chest. "Let's start with the basics. Most species here evolved on relatively stable, controlled worlds. No wild climate swings, no constant threats trying to kill you every second of the day. But Earth," he chuckled, "Earth tried to kill us from day one." The Zalari noble leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." Carter crossed his arms. "Toxins, poisons, venoms. We've been dealing with them for millions of years. Our ancestors had to figure out what was safe to eat, what wasn't, and how to push the limits of survival. Our bodies adapted. We process harmful substances better than most." He nodded toward the goblet. "What you gave me. Strong, sure. But we already deal with similar compounds in nature." The scientist's fingers twitched over their device. "That is unlikely." Carter grinned. "Ever heard of alcohol?" Confused glances spread across the room. The Warlord's mandibles clicked. "Explain." Carter spread his hands. "Humans are one of the few species that can regularly ingest ethanol, a literal poison, and not just survive, but enjoy it. Hell, we even build up tolerances to it. Our livers break it down, our bodies adapt. The fact that your poison has some structural similarities to substances we already metabolize? Well, that's why I'm still standing. The scientists hurriedly analyzed the toxin's composition again. Their eyes widened. Impossible, the chemical bonds. Carter smirked. Your poison is a sledgehammer. Works great when everything you hit is glass. But humans were more like rubber. Hit us hard enough, and we just bounce back. The warlord's claws dug into the floor. This wasn't just a failure. It was a fundamental flaw in their dominion. Their greatest weapon, their unchallenged symbol of control, was useless against humanity. Carter leaned back against the pedestal, arms crossed. So now the real question is, what are you going to do about it? The High Warlord's claws twitched, his entire frame rigid with disbelief. The trial of the unworthy had never failed. Not once. And yet here stood a human, not just alive, but mocking them. The poison, his people's ultimate weapon, had been rendered useless. The chamber was no longer silent. It buzzed with hushed whispers, nervous glances, and a dawning realization that rippled to the gathered species. The Krav were not infallible. Their power was not absolute. Humanity had just shattered an unspoken rule of the galaxy. Carter could feel the shift, the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts settling on the room. He smiled. So what happens now? You going to pour me another round? Maybe something with a twist of citrus this time. The warlord slammed a clawed fist against the pedestal, cracking the stone. You mock us. His voice was a low growl, barely restrained fury. Carter tilted his head. Not my fault your unstoppable poison turned out to be, what, an afternoon shot? Maybe next time, do a little research before assuming you can kill everyone the same way. The scientist was still running scans, muttering frantically in the Krav tongue. The warlord snapped his gaze toward them. Explain. The scientist hesitated before speaking. The human's metabolic system is unique. The toxin is breaking down before it can cause damage. Their body neutralizes it too quickly. Their voice grew uncertain. There is no flaw in the poison, warlord. The flaw is in our assumption. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. The implications were clear. If humanity could resist the most feared biological weapon in the galaxy, what else could they survive? How else might they defy the laws that had ruled civilization for centuries? The Zalari noble laughed softly, breaking the tension. Well, humanity proves to be far more interesting than expected. His crystalline fingers tapped against his throne. I suspect certain empires will rethink their stance on your people after today. Carter's smirk widened. Glad to hear it. The warlord's mandibles flared, but he did not speak. For the first time in his reign, he had no answer, no retaliation, no way to reassert control. The trial had been their ultimate tool of dominance, and now it was meaningless. Carter reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a swig, then extended it toward the warlord. Here, human poison. We call it whiskey. Want to see if you can handle ours. The warlord did not take it. His fists clenched at his sides. He turned sharply, his cape of woven chitin trailing behind him as he strode toward the exit. Without a word, the rest of the Krav followed. The trial was over. Carter grinned and took another sip. Somewhere in the galaxy, the legend of humanity had just begun.